This is a production of Cornell University.
Okay, so I think it's a little after 11, so we are going to get started. This is the organic no-till session. So I hope everyone's having a good time and enjoying what you've seen so far. But we're going to be talking about organic no-till. I'm going to tell you about my experiences, and then we also have some farmers who have been practicing organic no-till for several years now. So just to start off, how many people have worked with organic no-till before? A couple people, okay. Yeah, so maybe half of you or so. So this is a different type of cropping system, okay. I'm going to start off talking about some of the benefits here, and then I want to talk to you about sort of my understanding of the system at this point. You know, we've had some challenges over the past several years, and I think there's a great potential with organic no-till, but it takes a little bit of additional management and a little forethought with this. So in terms of the benefits, as you can imagine, having residue like this, like we were talking about with the soil health session, that can be really beneficial for a number of reasons. Certainly to protect against soil erosion. All right. In the past year, we've seen quite a bit of increase in the extreme rainfall events. You know, 5 inches of rain within an hour. You know, a farmer just down the road experienced that a couple years ago. A lot of soil erosion there. So having this mulch there can certainly help with that. We can improve soil health, improve water infiltration, and another big thing here is reducing labor and fuel requirements. Okay. So in the past, I've always kind of assumed that there are these soil health benefits. You know, I figured, you know, we can measure this, but you know, there's this assumption that they will be there. And I was more focused on this, you know, thinking that organic farmers, they do a lot of cultivation, and if they can get away from that cultivation, that inter-row cultivation that they would typically do in soybean and rely on mulch, then that would be really beneficial for them. So this is a photograph from down at Penn State, and we're happy to have Bill Kern and Mary Barberchek in the room who have worked in this system down at Penn State with organic rotational no-till. And I think it's important to just recognize what we're talking about here. So typical organic management starts with, you know, some moldboard plowing most of the time, some blind cultivation, either tine weeding or rotary hoeing, and then multiple passes with inter-row cultivation. And what we're trying to do with this organic no-till system is to reduce this, basically eliminate this, and substitute it with this system where we're rolling down this cover crop and then no-till planting crops like corn and soybean behind it. I'll just tell you right now that most of the presentation will focus on soybean, organic no-till soybean. We have done some work in organic no-till corn. It has not been as successful. We've experienced quite a bit of problems. Certainly in New York, it's even more challenging. But where we do see consistent success is with organic no-till soybean into rolled cereal rye or rolled triticale. Okay, so here are some numbers from a modeling exercise that we did, looking at a corn, soybean, wheat rotation and comparing traditional tilled organic to this organic no-till system. And in this comparison, both the corn and the soybean were no-till planted. Okay, that was the assumption that we were making there in the model, and compared to this with the traditional tillage. And when we compare to traditional tillage-based management, we see 27% reduction in diesel fuel, 31% reduction in labor. Okay, and also some other environmental benefits in terms of reduced energy use and reduced greenhouse gas emissions. Okay. So I'm going to be providing some of a broad overview, okay, and you know, I think it's really important to think about your cover crop and consider your cover crop to be a critical part of the system here. Unlike other cropping systems where, you know, your main focus is your cash crop, and you know, if you're lucky and you have some time, then you put in your cover crop after your cash crop is harvested. You know, this is a bit different. You know, you really need to be treating your cover crop like a cash crop. Okay, so what that means is seeding early in the fall, using good seeding at a higher rate than what you might normally do. Okay, And so these are some photographs from Klaus Martin's farm here. This is when Jeff Liebert, a graduate student in my lab, was doing some on-farm research with Klaus, looking at barley and triticale and rye. And so this is Klaus's tractor here with a front-mounted roller. Okay, and you can see the different cover crops here that were rolled down. And what we've seen both down in Pennsylvania and up here is that if you don't have the timing right, if you are not managing at the correct time, there's potential for reseeding. Okay, and this can be a problem in some situations, maybe not so much of a problem in others. Okay, so this is what this looks like. So over here, this is down at Rock Springs in Pennsylvania. So this was cereal rye that was rolled too early. And so typically what we say is when you're rolling it down, you want to see pollen. Okay, so that's when you can consistently kill it with a roller crimper. Okay, this cereal rye. And it's for people that are allergic to cereal rye, that's can be really dangerous and quite problematic. But in general, you want your tractor covered in pollen if you want to be doing it if you're doing it at the right time. And so this is rye that was rolled too early, bounced back, and that rye is going to seed here. This rye over here, this was rolled a little bit later, and you can see the effective termination there. Okay. Claire Keene, who was a graduate student with Bill Kern down at Penn State, she just published a paper looking at the effect of this bounce back and this incomplete kill. And what can happen is if this goes to seed now, and you can imagine that there would be volunteer crops in the future. And so if you are following this rotation, following soybean with wheat, having that wheat or that rye contaminate your wheat can be a big problem. However, if you're planting triticale after this and you're harvesting it for forage, it may not be such a big deal. All right. So really, your crop rotation kind of dictates how important the timing of that rolling really is. Okay. And so this system, it requires a different approach. So I really want to emphasize this. Greater attention to detail here, advanced planning, and adaptive management. So what I mean by advanced planning, when you're thinking about doing this organic no-till soybean system, you really got to plan ahead. You got to be thinking about when you're going to plant your cover crop. And so typically you need to be ordering seed in July the year before you are going to be planting your soybean. All right? Get your seed in the ground, get your rye growing or your triticale. And then adaptive management. That's something I think we need to pay more attention to. It really requires everything to line up in this system for it to work well. I'm totally convinced it can work well. There are a lot of benefits, and you can get high yields in this system, but it takes everything to line up properly. All right? And if things don't line up, okay, so say you're prevented from planting your cereal rye and you don't get it until late, or if there's a problem, heavy rainfall, and you have, or bad seed, and you don't have a good stand, you need to change your plans and not proceed with this. So it's good to know what these thresholds are. All right, so know when to do something different. Know when to plow. Okay, so that's really important. And then equipment. For this system, it takes different equipment. So we're using no-till planters that are heavy, that have a coulter up front to cut through that residue, and then get good seed-to-soil contact. Okay, and then unlike traditional tillage-based management, there are some different pests that we have to deal with. Okay, perennial weeds can be worse in this system. Okay, early emerging weeds such as common ragweed. That's our #1 weed problem in this rolled cereal rye no-till soybean system. And the common ragweed is a problem because it actually emerges and before the cereal rye is rolled down. The cereal rye is at a stage, like I said, when it's going into anthesis and you see pollen, where it's very easy to kill that mechanically. When you have a little rye seedling or a little ragweed seedling in that rye, the roller crimper will go right over top of it and it'll go right through that mulch. And so it's these early emerging weeds that are emerging before the cereal rye is rolled down that are problematic. We also have a number of different insect pests that can be problematic. Before coming to Cornell 5 years ago, I was working in Pennsylvania, I saw problems with armyworm and black cutworm. And then just this past year, working with Janet Stegny on a local farm in Groton, we saw seed corn maggot. And that was the first time that I ever saw a seed corn maggot, but it is attracted to this residue. And so it's another thing to watch out for when you're thinking about organic rotational no-till soybean. Okay. Just to point out, we do consider this to be a rotational system here. It's a rotational no-till because of those perennial weeds that I was mentioning. If you were to try to do continuous organic no-till, eventually you would have perennial weeds that would come in and tank the system. And so we really think that you need some level of tillage at some point in the rotation. Of course, we want to minimize it, okay? But that little bit of tillage, once every 3 years or so, can be really beneficial for managing those perennial weeds. So crop selection, really important factor here. Coming up from Pennsylvania into New York, I talked to a number of people about organic no-till, my plans to start working with this system. And I would come across a lot of farmers that said, oh yeah, I went down to Rodale before, I saw their roller crimper, I've tried that up here, and it didn't work. And what they would tell me was that they would roll down rye and no-till plant corn into it. And I think it's really important to recognize that that's a bad approach. I don't think anyone that's working on organic no-till would ever recommend that. And it's really because of nitrogen, all right? With soybean, all right, what we're trying to do, because soybean is a legume, right, it can fix its own nitrogen, we really want to make it work. And there are benefits with the rye with depleting the soil nitrogen. And so that has weed suppression benefits. And so that's really the goal with rye, to suck up all of the nitrogen that's in the soil and make that soybean more competitive against weeds. Because the soybean can fix its own nitrogen, and if that nitrogen's not there for the weeds, it's tied up in the rye, then that gives that soybean a competitive advantage. Okay? Some people have talked about trying to maximize your rye biomass and adding nitrogen to do that. Okay? And I've shied away from that. We are thinking now that maybe some of these thresholds that have been developed in terms of how much biomass you need, are not necessarily appropriate for New York. All right, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But adding nitrogen to your cover crop so then you can go plant soybean, to me, just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And you can run into problems where your cereal rye can lodge, and you can also give those weeds more of an advantage than they would normally have. Okay, but soybean into rolled rye, and if you are going to use corn, it's really important to go into a legume cover crop. Okay. Corn into rye typically fails. Maybe non-organic farmers, all right, that can put down starter fertilizer. There's certainly a lot of good planting green farmers down in Pennsylvania that are doing this, corn into rye, but for organic, it's just really tough. Okay? And so what we say is that, even with vetch, hairy vetch, I really like hairy vetch. I think it's a great cover crop. There are some problems with it in terms of it becoming a weed. Okay, certainly Klaus will say that he won't touch the stuff because he grows a lot of small grains. However, if you really want to do this system, with organic no-till corn, you should really be thinking about vetch, okay, and not rye. Some mixtures of hairy vetch and rye, or hairy vetch and triticale, they might be beneficial in terms of suppressing more weeds, but really, you need to watch out that you don't have too much of that small grain in there, or else you can have nitrogen immobilization or nitrogen tie-up, and it'll really make your corn crop suffer. Okay. So some of the other benefits with the system, as I was talking about earlier, with the extreme rain events and the soil erosion, we had a situation in 2015 or 2015, and also this past year where we had a very wet season. In 2015, our June was particularly wet. Typically, we have 4 inches of rain at our research farm. We had double that in June of 2015. And what was really amazing was I was working with a graduate student who was doing, Jeff Liebert, who was doing a timing study, a planting timing study, and he had 4 different termination and planting dates. And he was able to nail every single one of those termination and planting dates throughout May and June, even with this wet weather, because the rye in this system helped suck up that moisture and allow us to access the field. Where farmers that were working in tilled ground or did not have a cover crop, they were excluded from their fields. They just would bury their tractor if they tried to go out there. However, we were able to get out there and do it, and it worked really well. So here's some photographs comparing tillage-based management to the organic no-till system here. So you can see the rolled rye, bare ground. Okay, this erosion, this area here. This wasn't throughout the whole entire field, but we did see patches of this. Certainly problematic. Certainly don't want to see that. We didn't see any of that in the organic no-till rolled rye system. Okay. Here you can see that same area where there's just very poor drainage, but no problems with the organic no-till soybean. So in the past, really thinking about seeing these observations, these effects with the cereal rye being beneficial to deal with excessive rain. And so we always assumed that there was these benefits. Like I was saying before, I was more focused on the labor and the energy use, and just recently started to get into looking at the soil health aspects of this and trying to quantify the effects of this management system on soil health. And so I had another graduate student, Kira Crowley, and so she asked the question, compared to a no cover crop control, will integrating a cereal rye cover crop prior to soybean improve soil health, weed suppression, soybean yield, and profitability? So those are the metrics that she was looking at. Okay, and this was a research study that was done just north of here, about a half hour or hour at the Musgrave Research Farm. And so I'll show you some of her results. First, the treatments. So there are 4 different treatments that were compared. And so we were very interested in this roll-down system, the organic no-till soybean system here, but she wanted to compare that to standard management. A lot of organic farmers, they would put out a rye cover crop, but then plow that down and incorporate that rye cover crop at jointing. So that's one control. There are other farmers, maybe non-organic farmers, that are not using any cover crop. So we wanted to also include a no cover crop control. And then more recently, there's been a lot of interest in harvesting cover crops for forage. So she included a rylage treatment here to compare. So there's 4 different treatments with the rylage harvested at boot stage, just like you could see in the photograph here. So these are the 4 different systems. And so, let's just take a look at this. Which system do you think had the best soil health here? And we'll try to make this a little bit more interactive. Any ideas about that?
No question. It's got to be the roll down.
Roll down system, right? Okay, what about what system do you think had the greatest profitability? Rylage. Okay, yeah, good. You're following along. Okay, so let me just show you the numbers here. We had 2 years that were very different from one another. All right. In 2015, it was very wet, like I was saying. In 2016, it was a drought year. All right. So this is the average line here. All right. That's the normal accumulation of precipitation. All right. And throughout the spring and the growing season. Again, 2015 being very wet. All right. And 2016 being very dry. So this is a really good comparison here, looking at these 2 years to see how these different systems perform in these contrasting environments. Okay, so we're seeing rye cover crop biomass, and I apologize for the metric units, but I think you can just assume that this says pounds per acre. Okay, they're very similar, those units, and so you can see there was a difference in years. We had a greater cereal rye biomass in the spring of 2016. And that was really related to the seeding date here. Okay, the first year we didn't get our rye cover crop in early as early as we would have liked, and so we were suffering a bit with that lower biomass in these 3 different systems. But the difference between these treatments, that's all related to the different timings of the management. So higher biomass in the roll down system because we were waiting to anthesis until we would terminate that cover crop. This was terminated a bit earlier, the rylage, and the plow down was terminated just prior to jointing. Okay? So that's the rye biomass, and biomass increase with termination date, right? And so here's the soil respiration data. Okay? So what we do see is that there looks like there's a trend, okay? But when we look at the statistics, we see that there is a difference, all right, between the roll down system and the no cover. Okay? These other treatments here were intermediate, okay? But this microbial respiration, this is one of the soil health indicators that we were talking about earlier in the soil health session. And this just goes to show you that there is some activity, some more microbial activity that's happening in the soil, and that this rye, especially in the roll down system, having that mulch there is helping promote those and maintain those beneficial microorganisms. Okay. Sorptivity, this is a metric of water infiltration. So higher sorptivity, greater water infiltration. Okay, and what we're seeing here is compared to the no cover, okay, we see greater water infiltration in the roll down system compared to the no cover, where these other two are intermediate. Okay, and when we do have these extreme rain events, we think that this is going to be really important. Okay, people that have the rolled rye system and that have that mulch there and are protecting their soil, more water is going to go into the soil, less of it's going to go off and take your soil with it. Okay. Weed biomass. Okay, so these other systems, all right, all using mechanical cultivation. So no cover, plow down, rylage. So we went through, used moldboard plow tillage, did some blind cultivation, and then inter-row cultivation. Standard management practices for organic farmers, and then the no-till was obviously that mulch that we were relying on for the weeds. But here, you can see a lot more weed biomass in the roll down. For anybody who knows anything about weed biomass in these units and has experience on organic farms, you would know that these levels are extremely low. Okay? So 300 or 500 kilograms per hectare of weed biomass, that's really not a whole lot of biomass at all. So we were quite happy, even though this bar is so much higher than these, you're still getting very good weed suppression for an organic situation. Okay? Does that make sense?
Your rylage wouldn't be very high for a chemical system.
Right, exactly. I mean, this is the type of weed suppression that you might expect in a herbicide-based system, right? Yep. Yeah, and please, as we go on, feel free to ask a question or shout out a comment. Okay. So these are the treatments just prior to harvest, and this is 2015. We did one other thing that I didn't tell you about. We actually interseeded some hairy vetch into these plots. Okay, and that's just want to explain what that green is. Those aren't weeds. That's interseeded hairy vetch. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that, but I think there's a lot of potential with interseeding and actually using hairy vetch in this, particularly in this organic no-till system, to get a cover crop established. All right, so this is the rough year here, the drought year. Okay, so very good production, with the no cover, with the plow down and the rylage, nice soybeans, and then we just had a mess over here. The soybeans, all right, we planted them, no-till planted them into very, very dry conditions. That seed sat there. We didn't get any rain afterwards, for no kind of measurable amount of rain for a month or so, and those soybeans just they were stunted. They weren't growing as fast, so the growth rate was much slower, and our yields were lower, as you'll see. That is interseeded hairy vetch here. Yep. Okay. Also some weeds in there as well. The vetch wasn't counted in the weed biomass slides that I was just showing you. Okay.
How do you get the vetch established in the rye mulch?
We use a high clearance drill interseeder. So we will see one tomorrow if you go on the tour. See one in action. Rod Porter brought one down. Yeah, or right, yeah, Bill Kern's talk, in the interseeding session.
Go back one slide so we can compare to the
Yep.
Do you notice a delayed maturity in the wetter year? We're noticing in Vermont, crop is planted into that roll
So say that again. So you're
Delayed
seeing,
maturity in the crop, almost, I mean, so for us it's corn after rye,
yeah,
and we're just seeing it be later,
in the no-till, in the mulch system.
like the yields end up being okay, but it's
Yeah.
like 2-3 weeks later.
You know, we do see that. You know, we see side by side our soybeans, you know, getting yellow. We're reaching yellow leaf drop about a week or two earlier than in the no-till system. You know, and so I'm not quite sure what's going on there, but then that is pretty consistent, I'd say.
So
Apparently it's soil. When you go to a don't-till type setup on a planer,
Yeah.
then you're gonna have gas for weeks.
Yeah, exactly. So that's something that we try to avoid, you know, with the having that mulch cover up all of the soil there. Okay, so let me just show you the yields. So in 2015, again, I have this reference line of 45 bushels per acre here, but the soybean yields, I'd say for us, you know, under organic conditions, you know, we were happy with this in 2015. In 2016, we were really disappointed. And again, it's just because those soybeans had such a rough start in that dry conditions, in that dry soil and rye that was there, that they were stunted and they just never caught up. And so, you know, I think this is really important to recognize here that there are challenges. Before 2016, I was going around talking about organic no-till soybean as a solution to climate change, you know, all of the problems associated with climate change. And I thought, okay, well, you know, in the Northeast, our problems are too much water in the spring and not enough water mid-season. All right, and under, you know, the roll down system, that's where it really shines. You know, we have too much water in the spring, the rye sucks up that moisture, okay, and then having that mulch there in midsummer, that's where it really conserves that soil moisture, and that's really beneficial. However, this year it really caught me by surprise with this drought conditions in the spring in June. You know, so basically no water in 2016 in June, and that. You know, people talk about the dangers of cover crops in the West, you know, under dry, rain-fed conditions. And, you know, I never really thought that we'd experience that here, but here it is, and it was certainly a problem and something to avoid. Okay? So summary of our results from CARE's work. So profitability, as you expected, was greatest in the rylage treatment. And if you can make use of that rylage and then get a soybean crop in afterwards, you know, I think that's really nice. There were trends in soil health and in some of those other indicators that we're looking at where it might be better. We might just need more data to look at that to see if there are actually differences. More weeds in the roll down system. Lowest costs in the no cover, but lowest labor in the roll down. Okay. So I was thinking about, you know, the messages that I want to convey to you, and thinking about these indicators and thresholds that we have. And I think it's really important, like I was saying, to know when to pull the plug. Or, you know, if you're a Kenny Rogers fan and you know that song The Gambler, you know when to fold them, okay? You got to know when to hold them, but you also need to know when to fold them. And I'd say if you, you know, this will prevent a lot of problems, you know. I think people come to sessions like this and hear about organic no-till, they get excited, and they go out and they try to do it on all of their land or in areas where maybe they shouldn't try it. And so what we're suggesting is that people really avoid weedy fields. All right, don't try to put this in a field that you've consistently had problems with. You certainly want to avoid fields that have a lot of perennial weeds in them. I was talking with a farmer in, I guess, a little further west of here, and he took CRP land. I'm not sure if Tom's in the room, but he took CRP land, planted rye, and then did a no-till soybean into it. And it was really exciting. He was very enthusiastic about it. He was, this is some of his first experience with farming, and he wanted to do it this way. But he had a lot of perennial weeds. And you can imagine coming out of CRP land, you know, the Conservation Reserve Program, that you just have a buildup of perennial propagules. And fortunately, he was successful. I think he's getting a good crop and he's got a nice price for his beans, but it could have been a lot better if you would have went into a field or tried to deal with those weeds beforehand. Right? And then if you realize, for one reason or another, that your cover crop is just not going to do it, you know, it's not going to cut it, because it's too sparse or too thin. All right, as you can see in this cover crop, okay, these are weeds. That's black medic. That's not clover there. Those are weeds. And so if you're in a situation like this, I think it's just really good to recognize and to change plans, adapt. Okay, you might have had the best intentions of doing some organic no-till, but at this point you should really be thinking about either harvesting the rye or plowing it down or doing something different, mowing it. All right, because if you try to roll it down and you try to no-till plant soybean into it, you're going to have weed problems. Okay. So again, thinking about this year and these messages that I want to get across, if you're in a really dry situation like we were in 2016, all right, so no rain for a couple weeks before termination, before when you would normally plant, and no rain in the forecast. And I say either wait for rain or harvest for grain. Okay. At that point, when you want to no-till plant your soybeans, it may be too late to harvest that rye for silage and for forage. All right. At that point, you might just be better off harvesting it for grain and then going in with a different crop, sorghum Sudan grass or something else. Okay. Extra weight. So this is from Penn State. Putting I think bags of seed or fertilizer on the planter to get some extra weight because the soil was so dry here, and to get that coulter into the ground and to get better seed to soil contact and seed placement. Okay. So fitting into a crop rotation, this is another issue that often comes up. They say, okay, well this sounds really good. So how do I fit this into my corn, soybean, wheat rotation? And in New York, it's really challenging to do that. So we've been trying to put our heads together, working with our Organic Farmer Advisory Board, and trying to really think about how can you sneak in some organic no-till into your crop rotation, or how can you redesign your rotation so that you can accommodate this. And so the problem is that you really need to establish your cereal rye early. That's critical. So early September is ideal. All right. And after corn grain, it just doesn't work. You're not going to get the stand that you need for that weed suppression after corn grain. So you need to think about doing something different. You can't have soybean after corn if you want to do this and you're harvesting your corn for grain and you're in the north. Okay. What people are thinking about, what we're looking at is following or some of the issues with following organic no-till soybean. If you are going in with wheat, that's something that some people try to do. It's challenging even in a tilled organic system, let alone a system where the maturity is delayed and you may be pushed back and you're harvesting a little bit later. But just in general, it's challenging around here to get your wheat in on time after soybeans. The other issue with that cereal rye, that residue there can be a bit of a green bridge. And what we've seen in some cases is if you go in with wheat afterwards and you have a lot of rye residue, you can get diseases like take-all that can go in and be a problem for your wheat crop. So this rotation of corn, soybean, wheat, really challenging. There could be volunteer rye seedlings, like I was talking about earlier. If you have rye in your wheat, that can be problematic, especially if you're hoping to do something, if you're growing for a food grade market or something like that. And triticale, might be a better option, okay, following soybean. So you harvest your soybean, you have some time to put in something, but it might be too late for wheat. But triticale you can plant a little bit later, and the volunteer rye seedlings in a triticale forage crop are not going to be as problematic. Okay, so no big deal if you have some rye volunteers in with your triticale if you're harvesting it for forage, right? Okay, so this is a rotation that we're looking at in the organic cropping systems experiment at the Musgrave Research Farm. And so we have corn, if you will, up here at 1 o'clock. So I call this a rotation clock, but it's 4 years. 1, 2, 3, 4. Start with corn over here and interseed or not. But the next crop after that would be sorghum Sudan grass, again, to give you some time. Separate the corn and soybean. So you have some time to plant your cereal rye on time. Okay. Around here, there are markets for sorghum Sudan grass, for forage. A lot of people are getting into double cropping. A lot of dairies around here, so there is a way to utilize this. And then your cereal rye going into soybean here. You roll it down, and then triticale. after triticale harvested for forage, if you frost seed some red clover into that, you go back to corn grain that way. Okay, so this is something that we're actively looking at. We don't have a lot of data on this yet, but we think that this is going to be a lot better than trying to cram things in with a corn, soybean, wheat rotation. And even though we're taking an extra year growing forage crops, we think we're going to be better off in terms of weed suppression and overall profitability. Now, of course, you need to have a market for those crops, for that forage, and a way to utilize them. But around here, it seems feasible. Okay. So how much time do I have? I'm really over. Okay. So I'm going to slow down here, and I do have some more slides for the rest of the time here. It's going to be a bit of a discussion. We have Klaus Martins, who's going to talk for a bit about his experiences and his thoughts on this system. We can always come back to some of the slides. I'm happy to talk about this. And if Klaus brings up something, or if Bill brings up something and I have a slide that may be helpful to explain it, I'll just throw it up. But Klaus, I'll turn it over to you, and yeah, we'll take it from here.
I planned some a little different direction, but.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.